well, thank you. So this is the title for my talk, What Are Large Language Models Doing? And I'll explain that in more detail in just a moment. To begin with, let me just say a little bit about this moment that we are living through. This is, I think, perhaps the moment that many philosophers have been waiting for, the philosopher's moment. The moment when we are finally in demand. Imagine if you graduate from medical school, then you secretly hope that at some point you will be called upon in public to step in and save the day when there is some medical crisis. Is there a doctor in the house? Is there a doctor on board? And you will stand up and say, yes, I'm a doctor. I can help. I can save the situation. And this, I think, may be the moment when society calls out, is there a philosopher amongst us who can answer these difficult questions that AI is posing? And we stand up and say, yes, we are philosophers. We can help. At least that's how it should be. Whether we will be able to rise to that challenge, I don't know. There are certainly some difficult and pressing questions that are being posed by the current generation of AIs, in particular by large language models, which are the topic for this conference. Here are some of the questions they pose. They pose social and ethical questions. Questions about how we're going to live with this new technology and what impact it's going to have on our society and our economy, and what social and economic effects will large language models have. How can we prevent them being used for nefarious purposes to spread misinformation and mislead people? How should we regulate the development of LLMs? These are not easy questions at all, but they are very urgent ones. And they're questions for everyone, of course, but I would hope that philosophers can contribute something to this debate. There are also, and there are many more questions of that kind, there are also psychological, metaphysical questions, questions in the philosophy of mind, questions about the nature of these things that we are creating. Do they have minds? Do they have mental states? Do they have beliefs and desires and thoughts? Do they understand what they are saying? They give the impression of doing so, quite a powerful impression, but is that just an illusion? Are they conscious? It has been suggested that they are. And so on. Now, my question in this talk is going to be one of the second kind. It's going to be a question about what LLMs are doing. And by that, I mean, what are they doing intentionally? What, if anything, are they doing intentionally? Are they performing intentional actions? I mean, we know, in one sense, we know perfectly well what they're doing. They're spewing out text in response to prompts that we give them. But are they performing actions? Are they doing these things? Are they producing these responses for reasons? Which is equivalent to asking, do they have propositional attitudes? Do they have beliefs and desires that motivate them to give these responses? So that's the question I'm going to focus on. And in addressing that question, I'll also be asking how the kind of thing that LLMs are doing, how that compares with the kind of things that we do when we speak and we produce utterances. And the answer that I give will have some implications for the questions of the first type, questions about the risks that LLMs pose, the social risks that LLMs pose, and I will come back to those at the end of this talk. Okay. So that's my question. Now I'm going to address this question from what I'll call an interpretivist perspective. Interpretivism is perhaps not the best word, perhaps not the ideal word for the kind of position I have in mind, but it's perhaps the least bad one. The position I mean is the view that propositional attitude descriptions of beliefs and desires and so on are sensitive to behavioral evidence alone. They're warranted simply by the behavioral facts, the observable behavioral facts. So this sort of view, to believe that P is to display a pattern of behavior that's characteristic of P belief. Okay, so it's to behave like a P believer, relative to some standard or model of belief. There could be different standards of belief, different accounts of what it is to behave as a P believer. But on the view that I'm focusing on here, all there is to being a P believer is displaying the right kind of behavior. So this view, we might, interpretivism is one view for it. We could call it dispositionalism, perhaps, to have the dispositions, behavioral dispositions of a P believer. Different views, different versions of this approach, of this strategy, have been proposed. A famous version, I guess, is that proposed by Daniel Dennett, which I'll say more about in a moment. But also a very influential version proposed by Donald Davidson. And more recently, this sort of perspective has been defended by a younger generation of writers, including Bruno Mulder, Devin Curry, and others. And it's very much a alive and important perspective in philosophy of mind. I'm going to focus on Dennett's version of this. Here's a photo of Dennett taken in Crete a few years ago. And his view, as I'm sure you know and don't really need reminding, links possession of propositional attitudes to what he calls the intentional stance. And it focuses on the role of propositional attitudes in practical reasoning and the prediction of behavior. That's the relevant standard or strategy for ascription of belief. And it works like this to decide whether a creature has propositional attitudes and what kind of propositional attitudes it has. You adopt the intentional strategy. You treat the target as the target of prediction as a rational agent that has beliefs and desires and other mental states. And you ascribe to it those beliefs and desires that best predict its behavior on the assumption that it is a rational agent and that it is going to perform the actions that are rational in the light of those beliefs and desires, in accordance with norms of practical reasoning. So as Dennett says here, what it is to be a true believer, genuinely to have beliefs and desires, is to be an intentional system, a system whose behavior is reliably and voluminously predictable via the intentional strategy. Okay. And there are certain qualifications and refinements of this that need to be made. The point about reliably and voluminously predictable is important here. In order to count as a true believer, adopting the intentional strategy has to get you real, in order for a creature to count as a true believer, adopting the intentional strategy towards it has got to get you real predictive power. Okay. Power that's not available from other perspectives, from treating it simply as a physical system, obeying physical laws, or from treating it as a designed artifact that is doing what it was designed to do. It's got to get you an extra predictive leverage. Okay, so I think this is an attractive view of the function of folk psychology, of what we're actually doing when we ascribe propositional attitudes to each other. I'm not going to argue for that view here. The case has been made by the authors I mentioned, and I've said something about this myself in other places. It's worth stressing just a couple of making a couple of observations about the view, though. First is that it doesn't make propositional attitudes observer dependent. It's not the case that a creature or system possesses propositional attitudes only if it's actually interpreted by someone as possessing them. That's not the point at all. The point is it possesses them if it's interpretable as possessing them, if it exhibits behavior that is interpretable as intentional in intentional terms, should anyone care to do it. Okay, so Robinson Crusoe alone on his island with no one around to interpret him still displays behavior that is interpretable via the intentional strategy and therefore still has propositional attitude. As Dennett puts it in a famous 1991, is it? Not sure of the date, paper, Real Patterns. Propositional attitudes are picking out real patterns in behavior. Okay, so it's a realist position about propositional attitudes. A form of mild realism, perhaps. It doesn't. It's just on this view, propositional attitude descriptions are not picking out real internal, discrete internal states of a cognitive system, but they are picking out real observer-independent features, real patterns in the creature's behavior. Another observation worth making that we'll come back to later is that there needn't be a single correct interpretation on this view. It's possible that different patterns of different descriptions of different clusters of propositional attitudes might have similar or equal predictive power, and both could be legitimate because both could be picking out a real but distinct pattern in the creature's behavior. Okay, so this is compatible with rival but interpretations, neither of which is the uniquely correct one. And one of the attractive features of this view is that it's not anthropocentric. It doesn't tie propositional attitudes ascription to our conception of the human mind, to our views about how we think our own minds work. Okay. And so it's accommodating to the ascription of propositional attitudes to other animals, indeed to inanimate systems, and to AIs. So it's a good perspective to adopt if we're considering AIs, because it doesn't bring with it a lot of anthropocentric baggage. And that means that if we conclude that AIs don't possess propositional attitudes or don't possess certain kinds of propositional attitudes on this view, then we've given them, we've been as fair to them as we can be. Okay, we've given them their best shot at having them. Okay, so we've not weighted the, we've not come with a human bias against their having them. Okay, so and it's quite plausible to think that some AIs do have propositional attitudes given this perspective. And here's a famous quote from a paper that Dennett wrote quite some years ago, published in Brainstorms in 1978, but I think written earlier than that, a paper about B.F. Skinner and his brand of behaviorism. And it's a quotation referring to the behavior of an early chess computer. And someone remarks of this chess computer, it thinks it should get its queen out early. And Dennett comments, this ascribes a propositional attitude to the program. A belief about the strategy that it prefers, or perhaps a preference for a certain strategy. It ascribes a propositional attitude to the program in a very useful and predictive way. Okay, because if you know this about the computer, then you can predict how it will respond in the early stages of the game, and you can exploit that knowledge in your responses to it. But for all the many levels of explicit representation to be found in that program, nowhere is anything roughly synonymous with "I should get my queen out early" explicitly tokened. Okay, so that attitude doesn't need to be explicitly encoded anywhere in order for the computer to count as possessing. It can be in some way emergent in a weak sense from all the stuff that is coded there. So interpretivism is quite liberal with propositional attitudes, attitude descriptions, and is quite happy to ascribe them to, an interpretivist is quite happy to ascribe them to AIs, okay, in principle. So from that perspective, let's ask the question, do LLMs have beliefs? In other words, is their behavior reliably and voluminously predictable from the intentional stance? Also, why is there a picture of Honoré de Balzac here? Will all fall into place. Now, of course, the behavior of an LLM is linguistic only. It's a very limited kind of behavior, but quite a rich variety within that. But of course, that's not an objection to ascribing propositional attitudes to it. A chess player's behavior is pretty limited too. It can only make chess moves. So the question is, does adopting the intentional stance predict an LLM's linguistic responses? Okay. So let's do a little test. Does ChatGPT, I think I'm just using the free version, which is 3, I think. But that's all to the good, because if it looks like it's if that relatively relative to the next version, it's relatively primitive. If that version qualifies as having them, then the more advanced versions will. So does ChatGPT have a belief about where Balzac, Honoré de Balzac, the novelist, the French novelist, was married? Some of you may guess, if Dennett's listening, Dennett's listening, he will definitely know. Some others of you may know why I've chosen that example. It will be revealed later. Okay, well, let's ask it. Let's see. And let's see if its responses are predictable. You can predict its responses to these questions by ascribing that belief to it. Where was Balzac married? He was married to Evelina Hanska in a civil ceremony in the town of Berdichev, Ukraine. Tells you a bit more than I asked, but I do that all the time. In which town did Balzac's wedding take place? So just inverting the thing. It took place in the town of Berdichev, which is located in present-day Ukraine. This was an actual transcript. I haven't doctored this. I've just chopped it up to present it like below. So try and catch it out. Was he married in France? No, he was not married in France. His wedding took place in Berdichev, which was part of the Russian Empire. Note that I used in my second question, I used wedding instead of marriage, just to see if that would throw it. It didn't. So it's doing pretty well. And I think these responses are predictable on the assumption that it believes that Balzac was married in Berdichev. Okay, try and catch it out again. Was Balzac in the town of Berdichev when he got married? Yes, he was present when he got married. They were married in a civil ceremony in the town hall of Berdichev. Okay, trying to push it a bit further. Have any famous people been married in Berdichev? I'm not aware of any other famous people who have been married in Berdichev besides Honoré de Balzac and Evelina Hanska. Quite neat, I think. Neat sort of segue from, we'd already been talking about Balzac, so it said any other people. And then it says a bit more about Berdichev. Pushing it even further, did the town of Berdichev have any emotional significance of Balzac? Yes, the town had emotional significance for Honoré de Balzac. It was where he married Evelina Hanska, the love of his life, and so on. A bit more about that emotional, why that was, about the nature of that relationship and its emotional significance. Finally, as a little simple bit of practical reasoning, if Balzac is Sally's favorite author and she wants to visit the town in which her favorite author was married, where should she go? Well, it tells you that she should go to Berdichev. Okay, so that's a pretty fairly impressive bit of performance, I think. And it looks like ascribing that belief to him predicts its responses to that bunch of questions pretty well. And I don't see how you could have predicted those responses in any other way. It's not just got that bit of information in like an entry in a database and it's just repeating it in response to certain cues. It's using that piece of information very flexibly to answer a range of questions that are semantically related. So given that it can only do linguistic stuff, it looks like this predicts its behavior pretty well. Okay. So, and of course, that's just one very obscure fact. Okay. I'm sure you could do that with millions of other bits of information. So LLMs seem to be richly equipped with beliefs from this perspective. Are they really, though? Here's the question: what linguistic acts are these beliefs motivating? I've just talked as if these beliefs are motivating its responses, but what linguistic acts is an LLM performing when it produces those responses? So, well, there's a picture of a most famous book on this topic, Jane Austen's How to Do Things with Words, which distinguishes three kinds of linguistic act: locutionary acts, which is just simply the act of saying something, uttering a meaningful sentence. Well, it looks like LLMs are doing that. But that's not all we do when we talk. We also perform illocutionary acts. We do things in saying something. We don't just say things for the sake of it. At least, well, qualify that later, but generally we don't just say things just for the sake of making meaningful utterances. We say things because we're trying to do something in saying it, such as informing, advising, ordering, warning, promising, reminding, and so on. We say these things in order to perform some communicative act, as a way of performing some communicative act. A communicative act that invites a response. So informing invites belief, ordering invites compliance, questioning invites an answer, and so on. So illocutionary acts. And then Austen also distinguished perlocutionary acts, which are acts are achieved, acts of doing something by saying something. The idea is that by performing an illocutionary act, you may achieve some further effect. So by warning someone, which is an illocutionary act, you may alarm them. By informing them, you may persuade them. By warning them, you may annoy them. And the difference between these two is that you can make the former, you can perform those simply in virtue of saying the right words in the right context, given suitable uptake from the audience. And you can make that explicit. You can say, I inform you that, and that's it. Given the right context and uptake from the audience, you have informed them. Similarly for ordering and so on. Perlocutionary acts require some further response beyond the simple uptake of what it is that you've said. I can't say, I alarm you that, I persuade you that. That's not within the scope of my performative abilities. Anyway, that doesn't matter to it. The point is, these are the things we do when we say things. We try to perform some illocutionary or perlocutionary act. We try to inform people, advise people, or perhaps we try to alarm them or persuade them. Okay, so do LLMs perform illocutionary and perlocutionary acts? Everything okay? Yeah. Okay. Well, let's assume for the sake of argument that they do perform locutionary acts. They do say things. They don't make meaningful utterances. What about illocutionary and perlocutionary ones? Well, these acts are motivated by communicative intentions, desires to evoke some response from a hearer or to have some effect on them. In the case of perlocutionary acts. So they're motivated by a desire to produce belief or compliance or caution or whatever it might be. And of course, as Grice famously illustrated, communication plausibly requires a lot of meta-level intentions too. It's not just that you intend to inform someone, you intend that they should recognize your intention. And I think also you intend that they should recognize that you intend them to recognize that your intention is higher order stuff. So Do LLMs possess communicative intentions? Do they want to inform us, advise us, order us, comfort us, and so on? Right. Well, I just find that prima facie very, very implausible. Okay. That's not an argument, but it's just a kind of incredulous stare. Okay. Why would they have these desires? What goals would such desires further? Why would an LLM want to inform me of something or comfort me? I find this hard to understand. LLMs are not social creatures, not even autonomous agents. They're certainly not social creatures. And these sorts of desires emerge in the course of social interaction, or they have a place in social interaction. So LLMs are not autonomous. They don't even know they've got a hearer. I mean, they're not sort of tracking their hearer in any way other than by the inputs they're getting. And then, of course, they don't know that those inputs are coming from a single individual. They're certainly not modeling the psychology of that individual. They're simply dealing with the text strings that come into them. And everything you type in is simply just expanding the input that it's getting. And the architecture is not changing all this time. You're just giving it a longer and longer input. Okay, so they're not sort of building a model of you. Okay, maybe the input itself is somehow incorporating a model. We could get into this. I don't know. This is an issue, and you might want to press me on this, but I just find it extraordinarily implausible to think that they have communicative intentions. But then, if that's right, if you're with me on that, then that poses a problem for interpretivism. Okay, so what I'm claiming then is that, sorry, I jumped ahead of myself. I'm suggesting that LLMs produce responses and effects similar to those of illocutionary and perlocutionary acts. I mean, the responses that an LLM gives may alarm you, okay, but it didn't intend to produce that effect, so it didn't perform a perlocutionary act. So they may produce effects similar to those of illocutionary and perlocutionary acts, but they don't produce them intentionally. Now, given that, do we even want to say they perform locutionary acts? I mean, what reason would they have for performing them? What point is there in saying something unless you're trying to do something in or by saying it? It's just going around just uttering perfect, meaningful sentences just kind of at random without any reason. And if they don't have any reason for producing them, do we want to even say that they're performing locutionary acts?
I have nothing to say.
This is the Oliver Hardy-esque view of LLMs. Maybe then there's no intentional interpretation of LLMs after all. Maybe it's a mistake to think of them as performing. Or maybe you didn't hear that. Maybe the audio didn't come through there from the little clip of Oliver Hardy. He said, you heard it. Oh, that's good. Okay. Then I'll spare you my Oliver Hardy impression. So maybe there's no intentional interpretation of them after all. Maybe we shouldn't even interpret them as performing locutionary acts. Yet, as we saw, ascribing beliefs to them as considerable predictive power. And how could you get that power except from the intentional stance? I don't know. Maybe there's a design stance story to tell here. I don't know. I can't think of it. Maybe there is. The smarter people than me here. But prima facie, this seems to be a problem for interpretivism. Either LLMs do have communicative intentions after all, because we want to give an intentional interpretation of them, and that's sufficient for having them, for having communicative intentions, or interpretivism's wrong and internal organization is relevant after all. That looks like a prima facie problem for interpretivism. Okay, I've got an answer to the problem that I've created. You see, that's a good philosophical move, to create a problem and then tell people you have an answer to it. Consider, and what I'm going to do, I'll tell you the bottom line right away. I think they perform these acts for non-communicative reasons. So they are performing intentional acts. The speech acts are intentional, but they're not, the intentions that motivate them are not communicative. Okay, so let me describe this game to you, the chat game. It goes like this. It's a one-player game. A player receives textual inputs from an unknown source. And their task is to produce replies that are appropriate by human conversational standards. These standards involve things like this, that the replies should be informative as is required by the context, not more, not less. They should be truthful or well evidenced, should be relevant, and they should be perspicuous. Now, I'm sure some of you know where those four come from. They're, of course, Grice's four maxims of conversational maxims of respectively quantity, quality, relation, and manner. Okay. Now, I sort of took those rules of the game off the peg, as it were, from Grice. Maybe they might need refining a bit, but they're a good start, I think, for defining this game that I want to talk about. And these rules can also be modified or fine-tuned by means of ad hoc instructions that are applied to specific sessions of the game. Okay, so that's the generic game, but you can play specific versions of it, which have little, like Mornington Crescent, if any of you know what that is, that have specific fine-tunings, and we call these instructions prompts. So this is a language game in a very narrow sense. Okay, it's not like Wittgenstein's language games, which also included non-verbal moves, like bringing a slab. It's perhaps comparable to the language games that Sellers talks about in some reflections on language games, but with very, very limited entry and departure transitions. Those are just from bits of text to they're just from textual inputs to textual outputs. In fact, I don't think, maybe it'd be better to say there are no entry and departure transitions at all. They're the sensory inputs and motor outputs. That doesn't matter. Okay, so that's the game. Now, I suggest that LLMs are playing the chat game. In saying something, an LLM performs the illocutionary act of making a move in the chess game. So that's in the chat game. So that's what it's doing in saying something. It's making a move in the game. And that's the only illocutionary act LLMs perform. Everything they say is said in order to make it as a way of making a move in the game, as a move in the game. And LLMs perform it because they want to perform these acts because they want to play the game. They perform these acts because, well, yes, and that is their only goal. They may have instrumental goals, that they may have desires to do things in order to make the right move in the game, but their only goal is to make moves in the game. Okay, there's no goal outside the game. So they perform locutionary acts for a non-communicative reason in order to make moves in the game. So they speak for the sake of speaking. As Sherlock Holmes says, for the game's own sake. So ChatGPT said that Balzac was married in Berdichev because it wanted to play the chat game and believed that that utterance was a good move at that point. That's the intentional explanation I'm suggesting. That's the right intentional interpretation to give, I suggest. And the right, therefore, the right propositional attitudes to ascribe, given an interpreter's perspective. And it believed that that was the right move to make at that point, in part because it believed that Balzac was married in Berdichev. Maybe it had other beliefs about the conversational context and so on. I'm quite happy to be liberal with giving beliefs to LLMs. It's desires I want to restrict. So, chatting. What I'm suggesting is that LLMs are specialized game-playing systems, very much like chess playing computers, more like chess playing computers than like AGIs. They merely chat, using chat in a somewhat obsolete sense, perhaps not as obsolete as the OED says, to talk idly, perhaps not foolishly, just to talk idly, to prate, babble, chatter, to talk for the sake of it. And I'm suggesting that they are cognitively rich, they are rich in beliefs, and cognitively bankrupt. They have just one goal. They are very, very smart at playing a very difficult game. And in playing it, they mimic many of the responses that an AGI would make. So we ourselves sometimes play this chat game, perhaps at a party where you really don't know anyone and you just try to make conversation and you just say, the English are fairly good at this. They just say anything really just to keep the conversation going, because it's better than saying anything, revealing anything about yourself. And well, if the options are revealing something and being silent, well, you just make conversation, say something. Though even then, we're generally doing it for some purpose outside the game, such as being polite or just bonding. I put this little quotation from W. S. Gilbert. Dan was referring to Gilbert and Sullivan yesterday. So it's from Patience, which is, of course, a satire on the aesthetic movement. But those lines there, the meaning doesn't matter if it's only idle chatter of a transcendental kind. And everyone will say as you walk your mystic way, if this young man expresses himself in terms too deep for me, why, what a very singularly deep young man this deep young man must be. Maybe that's the sort of attitude we're taking to LLMs. Okay, so someone might suggest, and I'm tempted to endorse the suggestion, that if an LLM's world is entirely linguistic one, albeit one that we've hooked up to the non-linguistic world, but if it's if all it's dealing with, if it has no other interactions with the world except via tokens of sentences that we use in many other worldly contexts, then perhaps we should interpret it as having beliefs about that linguistic world rather than about the wider world, because it doesn't do anything with them. It doesn't get out of the language game ever and start cashing these things out in terms of referring to, pointing at stuff and getting stuff and perceiving stuff and so on. So maybe we should, the belief that we ascribe to it should be metalinguistic ones, to the effect, say, that a certain sentence can be used in a certain way within the game. So the belief would not be that Balzac was married in Berdichev, but that the sentence Balzac was married in Berdichev can be used to say something true within the game. I'm not sure how well that works, because you're going to have to explain how how it manages to make such flexible use of the information these sentences carry. Maybe you're just going to have to describe lots and lots of other metalinguistic beliefs to it, such as Balzac was not in France when he was married and so on. And I don't really know how to, if this really pans out with it. You're probably going to get at least as much predictive utility from the first order route than from this one. What this one does give you, though, is I think perhaps a more perspicuous interpretation. But of course, from the perspective of the intentional stance, perspicuity isn't the most important thing, it's predictivity. But anyway, there need not be a single correct interpretation, whether first order or metalinguistic. As I said at the beginning, both could be picking out real patterns, in fact, pretty much the same patterns. But this description, I think, does highlight something about the way that, about the nature of the world that an LLM inhabits. Right. Also, and either way, the point about desire stands. However we construe its beliefs, I don't think that we have grounds for ascribing any richer range of desires to it. And note that this is something I don't set out on the slides. I think that just describing that single desire to it, which I think is more plausible than describing a whole raft of communicative intentions, I think we get all the predictive power from ascribing that single belief, that single desire that we would get from ascribing a richer range of desires. Okay, so assuming there's something like a simplicity or economy constraint built into the intentional stance, that you don't ascribe more baroque states than are needed to do the explanatory work, then I think you get it all from that single desire. One interesting thing, though, which one reason I mentioned metalinguistic beliefs here is that it does highlight a connection with an aspect of human psychology, which is one that interests me very much. And I don't want to stress this connection or this analogy too strongly, but I think it's interesting. So I'm going to mention, how am I doing on time? Okay, another 5 minutes or so. Compare a certain sort of attitude that we humans adopt, a linguistically formulated epistemic commitment. We're language users. Linguistic artifacts are sort of all around us, and we take attitudes towards them. Sometimes, as Ronald de Souza said, we bet on sentences. We endorse a sentence with something true. We think, yeah, that sentence expresses something true, even perhaps if we don't really understand what it amounts to. I mean, I endorse the sentence E equals MC squared, and I can tell you what the terms mean, but that's about it. I don't have much deeper understanding of what it expresses, but I'll trot it out if you ask me to mention a physical key equation of modern physics or something like that. Dennett calls these states opinions. I call them super beliefs, because there's a kind of basic level of belief which is not linguistically formulated in this way, and then there's a higher level, a super level. And this is how Dennett describes his opinions. Once you have a language, all these sentences lying around, and you have to do something with them. You have to put them in boxes labeled true and false, for one thing. In Chekhov's Three Sisters, Chebutikin is reading, that's how I pronounce that right, is reading a newspaper, and he mutters, apropos of nothing, apparently, Balzac was married in Berdichev. Right? And he repeats it, saying he must make a note of it. Irina repeats it. Now, did Chebutikin believe it? Did Irina? One thing I know is that I've never forgotten the sentence. Without much conviction, I'd bet on its truth if the stakes were right, if I were in a quiz show, for instance. Now, my state with regard to this sentence is radically unlike my current state of perceptual belief, a state utterly unformulated into sentences or sentence-like things, as far as common sense or introspection or causal analysis can tell. Okay, so I'm suggesting that LLM's belief-type states might be a bit more like opinions or super beliefs than first order, than straight beliefs, basic beliefs, as I would call them, ones that are not linguistically formulated. Now, in our case, so I'm going on to a little bit of my hobby horse here, I think our linguistically formulated epistemic commitments have a powerful cognitive role. We can use sentences we bet on in processes of deliberate reasoning. We can take them as premises. We can actually entertain that sentence in inner speech, as it were, and think about what follows from it, and construct explicit arguments. I can do it with pencil and paper, indeed. That's when doing maths, which I would regard as this kind of an activity belonging to this level of cognition. And I think this creates a new level of self-control that's driven by these metacognitive attitudes, by adopting attitudes to explicit representations, personally available representations, sentences that you can actually write down or visualize. Then you gain a new level of self-control. I'm not going to argue for that here. I mean, I've tried to do so in the past in various places. And I think that when dual system or dual process theorists and psychology talk about system two, it's this level of personal deliberative activity directed upon explicit representations, that personally available representations that they're talking about. Again, I've argued that elsewhere. Anyway, So you could think of this, if you're familiar with Dennett's Tower of Generate and Test, which starts with Darwinian creatures whose responses are kind of hardwired in, and then Skinnerian creatures who have learned by reinforcement learning, and then you have Popperian creatures who have hypotheses about the world and try them out, and then you have Gregorian creatures who use mind tools and so on. You might think of this as a further level, creatures who are using explicit linguistic representations to do a certain sort of offline reasoning about the world. Now, okay, so where does all that, how does all that come back to LLMs? Well, I think what LLMs have is something like the form of a supermind without the mentalistic underpinning that motivates it. Okay, so in our case, we adopt these attitudes because we have this raft of basic level beliefs and desires that motivate us to do this. We want to solve problems. We think that we can solve them maybe by adopting this as a premise and trying to work out what follows from it, and yada, yada. They don't have that. They're just flipping these sentences around in the course of playing the game without putting them to any use, without putting them to any cognitive use. So as it were, they have the penthouse without the building. We've kind of built this strange thing that has the form of our most sophisticated intellectual achievement, but with none of the underpinning that supports it and makes it effective. So I suggest that insofar as that supermind, what I call the supermind, is the source of our general purpose reasoning abilities, I think it is, LLMs have merely a simulacrum of it. So this is where the form without the substance. Okay, so that's my account of what I think LLMs are doing and how their psychology, the similarities and differences between their psychology and ours. I'll just finish now by coming back to the other point I mentioned at the start, the social issues, and discussing some of the risks involved in training LLMs to play this game, the chat game. I suppose I'm right about that. What are the risks? Well, I think one is a devaluing of linguistic artifacts. Linguistic artifacts are valuable because they're effortfully created to express human needs. Ordinary utterances are crafted to achieve certain things that we want, okay, to express things, to try and affect things, try and get responses. We put a lot of effort into producing this stuff to make it work. Oh, to more advanced, a more sophisticated level, think of poetry and so all that is. By reducing language to a game, LLMs produce linguistic artifacts very cheaply. Or rather, I should perhaps say the designers of LLMs produce, I was going to say that LLMs devalue the real thing. Maybe it's better to say the designers of LLMs are devaluing the real thing because they're producing this stuff merely as a sort of play, dehumanizing. Again, language was created and shaped by humans for human ends. Playing it as a game for its own sake, their LLMs are dehumanizing the activity, not just in the sense that they aren't human, but that they're taking out all that is human from the activity. They're not simulating the human aspects of the activity. They're just talking for the sake of it. They're just making conversation. Another risk is that they may reshape the linguistic landscape or the corpus of linguistic production. Okay, like all the stuff that's on the internet. As LLMs learn from each other, they may reshape language in unpredictable ways. As increasingly as the inputs to the next generation of LLMs is increasingly dominated by stuff that was produced by the previous generation, they may reshape this corpus of text in unexpected ways. We don't really know what they're homing in on when they model the training data. Maybe they're picking up on patterns that are salient to us. Maybe they aren't. Maybe they're picking up on other patterns that just happen to have the side effect of being looking salient to us. All that matters is that they get through they work in the context of the game, and gradually, without our really noticing, this may reshape the nature of the game, and that, I think, is worrying. I think of George Orwell's point in 1984 that language constrains what you can think. If the shape of our linguistic inheritance is shaped non-human needs, simply by the needs of the game, then, well, I think you can see why that's great. But the game may develop its own internal logic, making it less suitable for our needs. Nearly done. Another worry, and this is something that's happening, and Henry talked about it yesterday, is that deep learning model, we can imagine deep learning models that treat other aspects of human culture as games. Finance, human relations, relationship, this is already happening. Politics, international relations. We may develop LLMs that can do that can play those games without developing the social attitudes that originally produced and sustained those activities. So increasingly, you'd have a culture that is completely heartless, if not completely mindless. Okay, so rich cognitive structure and a very, very impoverished cognitive volitional structure. And that, I think, is worrying. Because this culture is where we live. So the moral of all that, okay, is that it's just what we're doing now is we're kind of building AI from the top down. We're just building the top level, this fancy level of linguistic interaction. And we shouldn't do it that way. We should begin by creating autonomous systems that have their own interests, that operate independently in the world, have their own goals, and not just shaped to playing a certain game for us. Then we can socialize those creatures, teach them to use language for communicative purposes, just very simple sorts of uses that we teach children. Teach them to play the life game, the full gamut, the whole thing. And only then teach them to do these fancy things with language. And the great advantage of that, I think, is that if we socialize these creatures, then if we're worried about the effects that their actions may have, we can teach them to control themselves. I think the idea of trying to control LLMs, to regulate their use by external means, by law and so on. Yes, we're going to have to do it. I'm not suggesting we don't do it, but it's going to be hard to do. It's going to be hard. It's going to be very hard to do it without infringing on all sorts of issues of privacy and civil liberties and so on, because we're going to have to really monitor and control what's being shared online. That's the only way, I think, to regulate the use of this stuff, is to really monitor everything and track where it comes from and flag it if it's been produced artificially rather than by a human. And that's going to be incredibly intrusive. We're probably going to have to do something like that. And we're going to have huge penalties, as Dan said, for people who misuse this stuff. It'd be much better if we had artificial agents that had social attitudes and whom we could teach to control themselves. Okay, so that's a little bit of a rant there, but that's the moral of the top-down thing. Okay, that's enough chatter from me. Thank you very much, and I'll be interested to hear what you have to say.